Welcome to the JS Podcast. I'm Stephen Knight. I hope you're all well and keeping safe. Very pleased to be welcoming Yasmin Mohammed back to the JS Podcast. Many of you will be familiar with Yasmin and her work and her story. For those that aren't, Yasmin is a ex-Muslim activist and now an author. We'll be discussing her book Unveiled, How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam. And I really value her voice on this. She's a fearless champion of human rights within the Muslim world and a staunch critic of Islam and its liberal defenders. This is something that's really irritated me personally for the longest time, that when I would aim certain tools in the direction of Christianity and criticize and ridicule the extremism within Christianity and the extremism of some of its adherents and some of the murky logic in creationism and various other aspects, people would applaud and slap me on the back. My fellow lefty liberals would be all for it. And I noticed that when I pivoted these tools, the exact same tools, in the direction of Islam and the extremism within that religion, the praise and support dissipated somewhat. And it's always been a great source of frustration to me that my fellow lefty liberals are so blind on this topic and they drop their principles so freely. And Yasmin really articulates that brilliantly in her new book. And I keep thinking about how frustrated I am at this. I can't begin to imagine how frustrated she must be, being someone who's lived through the excesses of what Islam has to offer. So I'm always pleased to hear from her, and I can't recommend her book more strongly than I am. It's a fine read, it's passionate, it's to the point, and it not only takes a look at some of the issues within Islam, it also points the finger at those Ben Afflecks of the world who play saviour without actually dealing with any of the issues. So pick it up, buy a copy, get the audiobook if you want. Yasmin reads that too, so I shall put links to that in the show notes. We actually recorded this conversation in April, way before the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protest and riots and unrest we've seen from that, so that doesn't feature at all. I think COVID-19 was saturating every moment of our lives at the point of recording. It's funny how that concern seems to have slipped from our consciousness and our mainstream news media, but there you go. So send Yasmin some love, send her some feedback, send her some kind words. You can find her on Twitter at Yas Mohammed XX. I'll also put a link to that in the show notes. You can keep up to date on the podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy. It's a great pleasure to welcome the return of Yasmin Mohammed. Yasmin, how the hell are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me, Stephen.
It's my pleasure. It's good to talk again. Lots of good stuff covered last time you was on here. And now your book's out. We spoke about that at length last time. It seems to have taken an eternity, as these things do, to finally get it on the shelves. But it's here. Unveiled, How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam. So how's that going for you so far?
It's actually, turned out to be really positive. I was very, very nervous about it. In fact, I had decided I wasn't even going to publish it anymore because I was so sick of just the uphill battle of getting it published because of the topic. A lot of publishers just didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Did you get any feedback specifically about that from publishers? Was it kind of a generic response and you just kind of assume it's the subject matter, or did they reference?
No. Well, the literary agent that I had was in the UK. So most of the publishers that she was contacting were in the UK. And the overwhelming feedback that we were getting was something along the lines of, we don't have the security funding to cover a book like this because of what happened to Salman Rushdie. So they were really afraid of a huge backlash and they weren't willing to take on that battle. So that was the number one feedback. And the number two feedback was we already have a book written by an ex-Muslim woman, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And so why do we need a second book written by an ex-Muslim woman? So
I think we need thousands of books written by ex-Muslim
Right.
women, if I'm honest. That security thing's interesting. I mean, I don't know how it works in Canada, but in the UK, if you're holding an event, I think you have to fork out the money yourself for security. I remember being at the Secularist of the Year award a couple of years ago, and Charlie Hebdo won the award. However, nobody from that organisation would be there or could be there because the organisation couldn't afford the security bill. So it's quite shocking that people who are taking a stand on the topic of Islam and critics of Islam are actually being forced out of the public discussion for security reasons. And I know that happens to Ayaan a lot as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Did you say you decided to self-publish in the end, and that's how you got the book out there?
That's exactly it. Yeah. So I got really tired of the ridiculous feedback that it upset me, right? Because I was feeling like, when would this ever be acceptable? These are from supposedly, open-minded, intersectional. We really care about hearing about people from their authentic experiences. We want diverse voices, blah, 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 are the same people that are saying, well, we already heard from one ex-Muslim woman. We don't need to hear from another one. When would that ever be acceptable? Would they ever say, oh, we already heard from one black man, we don't need to hear from another one? It's just, they don't even realize how ridiculous they sound, and how they're being bigoted when they're pretending that they're all about diversity. And so obviously the diversity they're looking for is just identity. They want diversity in identity, but they don't want diversity in thought. So I got really frustrated with it all, and I kind of just said, I'm done. I'm finished. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm over it. I don't even really care. And then I had a conversation with Sam Harris, who convinced me to just self-publish. And I really didn't want to self-publish, but I thought I would take his advice, just because his advice has always steered me in the right direction in the past. And so I thought, okay, fine, I'll do it. I wasn't convinced. I didn't want to do it, but I just relented. And I'm really glad that I did, because his advice, again, steered me in the right direction. It has been able to reach people in a much deeper way than, just a tweet here and there, or a Facebook post, or even a lengthy podcast, or, all the different news organizations I've been on. It's like little 5-10 minute spurts. And you just can't really get into things as deeply as you can with writing a book. And so I'm glad that I was able to get it out there and get the whole story out there, and have a lot of people contact me and tell me that reading my story felt like they were reading their own story. And that was very rewarding, because that's what it's all about. That's the whole reason why I started this activism in the first place, was I wanted to reach people who I knew were feeling as lonely as I felt. And I just, I wanted to make sure that they didn't feel alone, that they knew that there were lots of other people that were thinking and feeling the same things as they were.
Yeah, I mean, that must be incredibly gratifying to hear that kind of feedback from people. But I mean, you mentioned Sam Harris there, and I love Sam in a number of ways, and I think he's one of the few sort of public intellectuals who has been so solid and consistent in his principles over the year, even on topics when I'm not particularly sure whether I agree with him or not, but I know hand on heart that he's attempting to get to the truth. That's his goal. It doesn't seem to be hidden agendas or overt biases in his thinking. So it's always somebody I gravitate to for information. And it's interesting to see how much the whole Ben Affleck versus Sam Harris thing was a catalyst for your venture into activism. And I don't know, I can't remember, when was the Bill Maher infamous Sam Harris v Batman incident now?
That was in 2014.
Really, that long ago?
A while ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was fascinating on, a number of levels. It really was a case study in this liberal confusion on the topic of Islam, and it was very strange to see at the time how many people on social media and opinion pieces were slapping Ben Affleck on the back for what seemed like a really bizarre and weak attempt at ousting racists that weren't even in the room at the time. So
yeah,
I was just wondering, but you luckily and thankfully you had a very different take on it. And I just maybe you could tell me a little bit how you felt watching Ben Affleck try to defend the honor of Islam on the Bill Maher show.
Well, it was really like, as you're in this, let me put it for you in this visual way. It's like you're in this dark room, and then you see this, this crack of light coming through, and you get really excited, and you're like, oh, look, the door is opening, the light is coming through. And then Ben Affleck comes along, and he's like slamming the door shut. He's like, no, shut this door. No. That's what it felt like. And it felt that way because it was so personal to me. So I wasn't out at that time. I wasn't a public ex-Muslim. I was an ex-Muslim from an Egyptian background, or I am an ex-Muslim from an Egyptian background. And here I am listening to these two men on, national television in this major media outlet talking about how in Egypt, over 80% of Egyptians feel that ex-Muslims should be executed. I'm like, holy cow, these guys are talking about me. Like, it made me feel like so heard and so seen in a way that I wasn't even hearing and seeing myself, because I was kind of like, my life, I had just put it behind me and I just moved forward, and I'd never dealt with any of that trauma. I just ignored it. I just knew that there was no space in the world for this conversation, so there's no point in even having it. And I saw these guys starting to have this conversation. Sam was talking about these concentric circles, and I was like, yes. And then, the white knight comes, shining, bounding into the room and starts shutting down the conversation and saying, no, this is gross, this is racist. So I felt truly betrayed. Like, I felt like, just shut up, Benjamin. Just listen to what these men are saying. Like, he wouldn't even stop for a moment to just hear what they were saying. He just kept on ranting and raving.
Yeah, it felt very much premeditated. I think Sam himself spoke about this in a blog post. I think Affleck was ready for this. I think there was a feeling that maybe Affleck had been briefed on Sam Harris, and he'd only got the Salon headline version of Sam Harris, and he was ready to take on this, this bigger, this anti-Muslim racist kind of guy. And that's essentially who Ben Affleck took down in that conversation. But obviously, it doesn't map on to what Sam was saying, does it?
Not at all. And the most surprising thing for me was the next day on Facebook, of course, when all of my friends and, my husband's family and everybody, all of my Facebook friends are all like, oh, yeah, Ben Affleck did a great job shutting down those gross and racist, white American men that are like being, horrible to Muslims and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, what is happening? I felt like I had failed to even communicate, because I had kept my life so private, my past life so private, I didn't even communicate to the closest people around me, my perspective. And so I felt like, okay, I have a duty here to at least let these people around me know that there's another side to this discussion, that they have to quit with the knee-jerk, oh, brown people good, brown people we don't criticize, and just pay attention to the fact that there are a lot of victims under there that you're ignoring when you try to defer criticism from Islam. And that's when I decided to write the book. Now, my idea at the time was that I would write the book anonymously and that I would just kind of throw it into the conversation, but I myself wouldn't get myself involved. I personally didn't want to get involved because of all the safety issues that we talked about.
Yeah.
But when I started writing my book, I was writing it as a blog online and getting feedback and stuff. And then I started getting contacted by people I mean, it was just like a flood of people so quickly from the first chapter telling me how much they related to my story and then telling me their story. And then these are people from like Saudi Arabia and Sudan and Somalia and Pakistan and, everywhere. And I thought, oh my God, like they certainly can't come out and say what they're feeling and thinking. And they were asking me basically, oh, we're so glad you're in the free West and you can say these things for us. And I was like, shit. So then I started to feel, ashamed of myself. And I felt like I had a responsibility to do that, to speak up for all of the people that can't speak up because they will literally be killed for it. And here I am living in a safe, free country. So I should take on the risk because it's obviously a much smaller risk than they're taking. And so that's why I became public after that.
Oh, that's great. I think not really the same, but a similar kind of thought process. It was when the Charlie Hebdo office massacres happened, and the Western media were such cowards in their reluctance or outright refusal to show the cartoons on our mainstream news networks. They completely cowed to Islamic blasphemy laws, and at that time I wasn't making public appearances. I was tweeting, I was blogging, recording podcasts, and that was the catalyst for me to start putting my face about and start trying to be more public with my criticism of Islam, because it is a case of we can all hang around and wait for somebody else to step up, but it is something we all have to do, really. And I completely understand the security concerns. I suppose any decision somebody makes on that for themselves is the right decision. We never pressurize anyone into being public advocates for criticism of Islam. But I mean, just to cast our minds back to 2014 and Sam Harris talking to Bill Maher, and you mentioned the concentric circles aspect of it, because Sam's very clear in his rhetoric. He doesn't generalize. He knows exactly who he's talking about, to what degree. He understands the nuances. He doesn't need sitting down and explaining that there are good Muslims. That's an absurd point. Yeah. But the fact that someone has clearly spoken and specific about his language, as Sam Harris, can get that kind of treatment from Ben Affleck, and then the comment pieces afterwards, just shows you what bad shape the conversation was in 2014. And I think people like Sam have always had the fear that if sensible liberals don't get empowered on this topic because of being shouted down as racist and bigots, scary people on the right are just going to step in to fill that void. And I just wanted to get your opinion on, since 2014, whether you think it's become easier for anti-racist, non-racist liberals to speak out on Islam, or the door has opened further for scary people to take centre stage on this topic.
Definitely the door has opened further for the scary people. There's no doubt about that. Sam's fear was warranted. And we did see it happen on many fronts, not just on Islam, but there's definitely been an empowerment of the far right. And have I seen a difference? I think that when the far right speaks up, when the scary people speak up, it actually makes it even more difficult, because here we are saying something that sounds similar to what they're saying. And so it makes people nervous because they don't want to even sound similar to what the scary people sound like, even if the people that are talking are coming from like a completely different place. Like it doesn't matter who you are. Obviously, it was easy to attack Sam, and it was easy to attack Bill because they were always being told, you're just white American men, so you have no place in this conversation, which I'm just going to digress for a little bit and say they absolutely do have every place in the conversation, because it's not like they went to Saudi Arabia looking for the trouble. Saudi Arabia brought 9/11 to their soil, so they have every right to be involved in the conversation. And the same is true for anybody in the Western world. The problem is in your backyard, so you have every right to talk about it. But it was easy to attack them just for being white men. And so part of the, what motivated me to speak up was I said, okay, fine, I'm going to be a brown woman and I'm going to say the exact same things that these guys are saying. And to a certain extent, it did protect me because when I was anonymous, I was getting a lot more of shut up, white girl, what do you know? And once I came out public with my name and my face, I got less of that. So then it kind of forced people to engage with the conversation. So as far as the difference, I'm seeing a difference in that people are feeling empowered to speak up and they're not getting shut down. Well, they are getting shut down, but they're refusing to allow people to shut them down because of their immutable characteristics. So in the past, when people would say, okay, you're just a white person, sit down and shut up, that person would be quiet. But now they're like, no, I'm not going to be quiet. My opinion matters just as much as yours. And so in that way, I am seeing a difference. But no, as far as the conversation around Islam, I think that, Trump is making it more difficult to have that conversation because of his Muslim ban. And there's this perspective that if you wear hijab, it's like an anti-Trump sentiment, when it pisses me off because it has nothing to do with Trump. It is an anti-woman sentiment. Like, can we just expand beyond just your little perspective of very American centric? But the same kind of thing happens all the time with when I criticize Iran, I'll have a lot of people behind me. But then when I criticize Saudi Arabia, I won't, and vice versa, People will be happy when I criticize Saudi Arabia. They'll invite me on CNN and Al Jazeera and everywhere else because they want me to talk about how horrible the Saudi Arabian government is because Trump is friends with Saudi Arabia. And in those interviews, if I try to interject, and it's also bad in Iran, women in Iran are also getting arrested, then they'll cut me off. They don't want to talk about that because Trump hates Iran. So that's, we don't want to talk about that. So it has muddied the water and made the conversation more difficult. So I'd like to be more optimistic, but it's difficult to tell. I think that I'm also in my own social media silo, so maybe I'm feeling a little bit of a difference, but I don't know how true that is in real life.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, isn't it? Trying to get a foothold on reality from your social media feeds. Okay, well, one thing I want to talk about the book, or specifically a running theme of the book, is the very strained relationship you have with your mother. And obviously you're very open about that. You speak very candidly about it in the book. And it might come as a surprise to many people, or I suppose maybe people that expect that in the world of Islamic theocracy and imposing of conservative Islamic ideals, it's genuinely considered the males to be the villain of the piece, and it's very rarely spoken about that women will enforce these rules as well, not only on themselves but on the rest of the family. And your mother, I suppose, almost reads as the villain of the book if this was a work of fiction. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how women come to self-impose these rules and regulations, which are the strictest towards women, and they're the most denigrating towards women. They crush the freedom of women. Yet there's a significant proportion of the Muslim world that are women that self-impose these rules and then try and impose them on other women. What's the psychological process there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess the shortest answer is internalized misogyny. I mean, it is patriarchy and misogyny to begin with, but it's women that perpetuate it. It's women that allow it to continue. They don't stand up against it. They support it. And, one really clear example of that is if you look at female genital mutilation. So it's men that say, I will only marry a woman who is cut. I won't marry a woman who is not cut because then she's obviously a slut and a whore. And so because men have said that, it is mothers that take their daughters to be cut with razors by other women. It is entirely women that are doing this. I mean, it's yes, it starts with men, but they would not be able to perpetuate it if it were not for the women. So, and again, even in countries where things like this are not, like, it has nothing to do with the law, there's no strong arming from, like say in Iran, for example, if a woman takes off a hijab, she gets thrown in prison. That's not the case like in Egypt, for example. But in Egypt, other women will shame that woman to the point that in Egypt, there was in public transit, if a woman was on public transit without hijab, and so in Egypt, they have different cars, like a woman-only car and male-only cars. And if she goes into a woman-only car, other women will have scissors in their bags and they will cut her hair as a message to her.
Wow.
That you should cover your hair. Yeah. So, I mean, those are just two examples. But yes, people see how my mom was the one that was very controlling of the situation. And they are surprised because they're used to hearing that it's the men all the time. But men would not have a chance if women stood up and said no. And if they said, no, I am not going to cut my daughter, if they said, no, I'm not going to make my daughter wear hijab. No, I'm not going to make my daughter get married at the age of 10. But women don't do that. Women support it. They support their own subjugation, and they support the subjugation of their own daughters and their own sisters and their own family.
Yeah, and we often hear as well in the West, even in the UK as well, about how often we're told that this is a personal choice. And it's like, well, sure, technically, but what are the repercussions for that young female for removing a hijab in the culture she lives in the community she lives in the family she has? There's no choice a lot of the time. And
exactly.
It's funny you should mention about public transport. Several years ago, I was on a bus in Greater Manchester, and there were two women. There's a man and a woman who were clearly a couple. The woman had a hijab on, and there was a woman sat on her own. And they were shouting at each other in a different language that I can't quite place. It got quite heated. Then the woman with the hijab and her partner got off the bus, and I asked the woman on her own, is she okay? And she went, yeah. She said, she basically said to me, that bitch was having a go at me for not covering my hair. So I told her to go and fuck herself, which I thought was great. But to see, to be in the northwest of England on public transport, to see something like that play out was quite shocking to me, really. I mean, that's the only time I've ever witnessed anything like that personally. But you imagine
a complete stranger too,
exactly,
right?
yeah. So I mean, yeah, they didn't know each other. She just managed to glean the fact that this woman was a Muslim and took it upon herself to shame her for not covering her hair. And you've got to think, well, how often does that kind of thing happen behind closed doors? In European households. So yeah, it's strange how this clear symbol of global female oppression, as you alluded to earlier, has become a symbol of feminist empowerment in some circles. And I suppose that ties into the subtitle of your book, how Western liberals empower radical Islam, because your book isn't just a criticism of Islam. Obviously, you're very passionate about that and you've lived it and you know your stuff. But part of you, I think, it feels to me that sometimes you're more frustrated with the failure of liberals to offer their support and stand up for liberal principles on this issue. I mean, in what ways does that typically manifest to you, that liberals fail to make the right noises in the face of Islam?
Well, it's not even that they fail to, it's that they actually empower it. They actually support it. So by them putting hijab as, on the poster for the Women's March, the liberal Women's March, by them putting hijab on the cover of magazines and in advertisements and splashing it all over the place as if it's something to be celebrated, that's them supporting fundamentalist Islam. That's them supporting victim blaming and rape culture, and this ideology that a woman is lesser than, and that she, the victim blaming around telling a young girl, you need to cover yourself lest you drive some man into a frenzy and he ends up raping you. Well, you enticed him because you weren't covering your hair, so that's your fault, or the slut shaming around telling girls, those of you who cover are good and pure and you're going to go to heaven, and those of you who don't are going to burn in hell and they're filthy and they're, free for all women. So, these are the kinds of messages that we already know are toxic messages that we should not be giving to young girls. And we don't give them to young Western girls, but we treat those girls differently. For those girls, all of a sudden it's empowering. Well, why is it empowering for a little brown girl and not empowering for a little white girl? Why do you have American women saying, we want to go topless, we want to free the nipple? And for them, that's empowering. But for a Muslim woman, those same people that say free the nipple for themselves will support hijab on Barbie's head and give that to a little girl to play with and teach her that that's something that she should strive towards. So there's such a hypocrisy in that. There's such a double standard in that. And to be honest, there's such a bigotry in that. And you're absolutely correct that I am more frustrated with them than I am with Muslims. And the reason being, Muslims are indoctrinated into this. I lived that life. I know how hard it is. It's like you're a fish and you're swimming and you don't even know that you're wet. I understand that it is a huge deal for them to be able to step out onto dry land and be like, oh, wow, I cannot believe that I was swimming in those waters. That's a massive step for them to be able to take. But I am talking to people who are already on dry land, who already understand the basics of feminism and the basics of gender equality. And those people are betraying their own values and are throwing these young girls, because they happen to be from a different culture, or they happen to be from a different geographic location, or they happen to be from a different religious background. I don't care. Why are these girls being treated differently than you would treat yourself and your own daughters?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you said you've lived it and you document that really well in the book, and you say something really interesting about your experience of coming through the other end of that and letting some of it go. And you said that if you're caged long enough, freedom feels weird, unfamiliar, and uncomfortable. And that's such a tragic thought to me, the idea that emancipating yourself can bring it and almost bring even bigger challenges in that sense of you trying to adjust to a quote-unquote normal, unrestricted existence. And maybe you can explain a little bit about how that felt and what sort of things were obstacles for you when you were starting to leave this religion behind that you'd had imposed on you to quite an extreme degree.
I mean, it was literally everything. It would no exaggeration. So as a Muslim, you are taught, like, it's called a Siratul Mustaqim, the long, straight, narrow path. And so the visual is you're walking along this long, straight, narrow path like a tightrope. And below the tightrope are the fires of hell beneath you. And so if you misstep on this tightrope, you're going to fall to the depths of hell. And so from the moment you open your eyes in the morning, every single step you take is outlined very, very clearly, and you have to follow it exactly. So, I mean, the way you cut your nails, the way you get dressed, the way you put your shoes on, the way you eat, the way you talk, the way you, everything, every single aspect of your life. And so when everything is it's sort of like a soldier, you don't think, you just do what you're told. And so you don't ever practice thinking, or you don't ever learn to think. You don't ever even consider that thinking is a thing. You just do as you're told.
Almost becomes a discipline in that sense.
Yeah. And then when that's taken away, and all of a sudden, you just feel like you're in the middle of this vast ocean where you could go in any direction, but you could also drown. Like, it feels very, it is incredibly scary. Like that leaving the religion and starting to build myself up from scratch. I could have written an entire other book about that, but it's such an internal process, though. It's really hard to explain words on a page, Like, I wouldn't really be able to tell you specific things about how it happened, but it's really just, Majid Nawaz in his book, Radical, he's still a Muslim, but when he talked about going from being an extremist Muslim to a regular Muslim, even for him, he went through this process, which wouldn't be as drastic, obviously, as going from a fundamentalist Muslim to an atheist. But he talked about rebuilding yourself brick by brick. And you pick up every single brick and you look at it and you think, why is this brick here? Is it here because I was raised to believe this? I was raised to think this? What do I actually think? And to even ask yourself, what do I actually think, is something that is so new. I mean, you don't even know I don't even know what I like to wear because I have never chosen my own clothes before. I've always been told, this is Vabe, you're going to wear this, you cover yourself head to toe in black. So I don't even know what colors look good on me. I don't know how I want to do my hair. I don't know what foods I like to eat. It's just a complete rebirth. It's like being a toddler, except you're a grown adult, and so you don't really have the time to make any mistakes and learn and grow. You have to be like, especially for me, because I also had a toddler that I had to take care of. So I didn't have time to sit with these questions for too long. I just had to go, go, go. So of course I made a lot of mistakes, especially in the days before Google. So it was just a lot of stumbling and just pushing myself forward. And it's one of the scariest things one could possibly go through. You go from complete order to complete chaos. But in that, I need to express that it was actually incredibly exhilarating, exciting. There's no price that you can put on the personal freedom and the liberty that, I mean, obviously everything that I said is true, is scary and all that, but I still would never have, I wouldn't trade it for the world. It was worth it all.
Yeah, these are various ways people can arrive at atheism. It can be an intellectual position to take. It can also be a result of a really horrendous experience with religion or religious community. And I was wondering if you feel there's any difference between those type of people who are not particularly religious but are convinced by logical arguments and philosophy and various authors and just take the position that there is a distinct lack of evidence for a creator, and people who have had a terrible experience with religion and come to atheism, speaking about like a religion, but come to the realization that there probably isn't a God due to their own experiences.
I think that both sets of people would have to also go through the intellectual thing. So both of them share that. Both of them, like, even though I had all of these negative experiences as a Muslim, I was still really believing that Allah would save me. Like he would be my savior from all of these negative experiences, even though he was the one that was creating them, But it wasn't until I took that history of religions course at university where I got to critically analyze the Quran for the first time, because you're not allowed to do that as a Muslim. You don't think, you just accept. That's when I first started to see the cracks. And so, but when you're coming out the other side, that's when it makes a difference. So somebody like me who is coming out of the fundamentalist, like the extremist and the true literal Islam, somebody who's coming out of it with my experiences versus somebody who's come out of it without having had those experiences. So they just had like the super liberal, or I shouldn't even say liberal because it's not even truly liberal, but super moderate Muslim. And their family were like, oh, okay, you don't want to be a believer anymore? That's cool. Well, we'll see you for dinner on Sunday. Like that kind of experience. We end up, so it ends up, because no two Muslims have had the same experience and no two ex-Muslims, have the exact same experience because we're all individuals and we all have very different experiences. But we can be grouped in those two experiences because one of us will be saying that religion is incredibly toxic and it causes all sorts of trauma. Stay away from it because we've experienced that. Whereas the other group of people will be like, well, it's not that bad. So they're really not understanding the extent of it because they themselves haven't experienced the extent of it. I mean, they've probably seen it on paper, but they haven't personally experienced it. And so I think that in my activism, a lot of the people that I'm dealing with are people that are mostly not even in the West, because generally Muslims in the West are not nearly as, as diehard as the ones that are living in Muslim majority countries where they can get away with it. Now, there are quite a few people that have had my experience, like this young woman whose family is from Afghanistan. She grew up in Canada and, didn't know how to ride a bus, didn't know anything because they kept her in such a bubble. It reminds me, my experience and her experience and the experience of so many ex-Muslims living in the West remind me of, I guess this is a good comparison, the Hasidic Jewish community in New York, where you can find some people from those communities that don't even speak English, or they don't speak English as their first language, people that don't have anything past a grade 4 education, like people that have really, even though it's New York, for goodness sake, they're living in such a separate bubble from the rest of the world. And then you'll see average Jewish people that did not live like that. That maybe their family were conservative or Orthodox, but they never lived under such an extreme religious fundamentalism. And so when you talk to somebody who is an atheist who's left the Orthodox community or somebody who is an atheist who's left the Hasidic Jewish community, you're going to have two very different, you're going to have two very different voices about what they feel about the religion of Judaism. So it's the same thing for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. And fortunately, there are a fair number of quite prominent atheist organisations and secular organisations and humanist organisations, and it's my personal thinking that if you're going to tout yourself as an atheist organisation or a secularist organisation or a humanist organisation and you don't have something to say about Islam, then you don't really have anything important to say. It's how I feel given the current climate. And talking about, I suppose, going back to how you mentioned being in bubbles, I tend to have a bit of an issue with the American organisations of late. I think their primary knowledge and experience and culture is Christian. Still think Islam's a little bit foreign to them in terms of the ideology, and obviously these differences in demographics from Europe to America. From what I can see, the Muslim population seems to integrate far better in the States than it does in, say, Europe. However, I think I noticed American atheists a while back, when the Christchurch massacre happened, they took that moment to share Huffington Post articles that were pointing the finger at Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, which is unforgivable in my book. The American Humanist Association seems to be obsessed with trans issues and pronouns at the moment. And I was just wondering how you feel about well-supported organisations in the States that just seem to have taken their eye off the ball on the biggest theocratic issue of the day, when that's really their mandate.
Yeah, no, I 100% completely agree with you. And if I may, honestly, I love Americans in general, but swear to God, they are the most narcissistic people. Like, they just, whether it's on the far right that are insisting that, America is the best country in the world, or whether you've got the far left that are insisting that America is the worst possible thing and Western civilization needs to be abolished. It's always about them. And so when you're talking about these American atheist groups, it's just about themselves. This is what's important to me right now. Muslims only make up such a tiny amount. I think it's like 1 or 2% of Americans. So it's just not front and center enough for them. And it really just goes back to like feminist issues where they're more focused on let's talk about, man spreading to death, but let's not talk about women going to prison because they're not putting a scarf on their head. Like it's that same sort of narcissism. Like we just want to talk about our little micro issues that are happening to us, and we don't want to look beyond that. We don't care what's happening beyond that. And but the thing is they will pay such lip service to it. Like if you're going to be honest and say, well, we really don't care what's happening beyond our borders, then just say that. But they don't say that. They pretend that they actually care about minority groups and authentic voices and diversity and blah, blah, blah. But it's all just a sham and it's all just a lie. And they really just want to talk about themselves.
Yeah, it's very disappointing to see that happen. I see a lot of, what was really interesting was there was a lot of, big atheist Twitter accounts in the States and atheist podcasters. And then at some point it became impossible to ignore the problem of Islam. I think mainly ISIS took care of that. And they suddenly felt that being an atheist Twitter account was beneath them, and they changed their focus on their podcast. And it just, it's all fun and games poking fun at the creationist or the Ark Encounter or Ken Ham, but when you actually have to have something to say about actual fascists, a lot of people went missing, strangely.
Yep. No, they'll have everything to say about fascists as long as they have white skin, but as soon as it's a fascist with darker skin or from a different geographic location than the one that they're currently in, then they don't want to talk about it anymore. So it's not about the values, it's about the identity, really.
Yeah, because that's rooted in almost a positivity to them. A lot of people can't see that it's just garden variety racism, isn't it? It's the racism of low expectations.
Absolutely.
And it gets a free pass because it's rooted in virtue. And it's amazing how many people get fooled by that and think it's somehow a really strong intellectual position to take, that you should address people differently or value their ideas based on the colour of their skin has never really sat right with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me about, talk about Full Circle. You were invited on Bill Maher's show. Has that gone down the pan because of the COVID virus, or is there other reasons?
Yes, so tragic. The day that Bill Maher had an episode where his guest came via Skype, it was like a doctor that had written a book about pandemics, I don't know. And he didn't even have a studio audience. Like, that was the day that I was scheduled to be there.
Oh, that's terrible timing.
It's such terrible timing, this damn virus.
Fucking pandemic.
That's right. I was supposed to, actually I was going to be on this whirlwind month-long book tour that was going to go across 3 different countries and dozens of cities. And the whole thing got shut down. And it's right now, everything is just, we say postponed, but we haven't decided on any dates because we don't know how long this pandemic is going to last. So for now, it's just, I can't remember. I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. Indefinite. There you go. Indefinitely postponed.
That is a shame. And hopefully that's something that can be picked up and ran with as soon as some sort of normality has been found. But I mean, I suppose on the topic of this virus, it is the backdrop of this conversation. The world has changed significantly since we last spoke because of this, and I just wondering basically how are you getting on, and what's the picture like in Canada? How are people taking it? I mean, is lockdown enforced there? What's the scenario?
Well, we are pretty lucky in Canada in that we have a very small population and the second largest landmass on the planet. So we have a lot of space and a little bit of people. So we're doing okay. And then also our government has thrown billions at this. So we're all, everybody's receiving money. If you're not working, you're going to be getting like $2,000 a month. And it's really no questions asked. I've seen people post all over Facebook and Twitter and stuff that they are applying, and then within 2 days, they're getting their money in the bank. So It's really efficient. And, we have universal health care here, which is, all the provinces are getting all the money and the support they need. And like I said, we have such a low population that we're able to handle it. We're doing okay. But everybody is self-isolating. Obviously the country is still running, so not everybody. Obviously the essential workers are still out there helping to, so the country will continue running. But we're doing pretty well. I mean, I'm not a fan of Trudeau or his government, but I have to say that they have handled this really well. Obviously, there are mistakes. There's always going to be things to criticize. And, obviously that's true. I'm not saying he did a perfect job. Nobody does a perfect job. We're all human beings. But I think in general, Canada's doing pretty well.
Yeah, I've been very disappointed to see the partisan response to a lot of the governments, especially in the UK. It seems to me that people are doing the very best in a very difficult and unprecedented situation. Obviously, there'll be the necessary post-mortem conducted on that when the dust settles, but I just feel there's been a lot of unnecessary swiping and sniping at various figures when it's clear that this is a big problem, and it's one that's pretty much unavoidable in the sense of it being, it's a global pandemic. It's not, somebody hasn't just left a virus on the side in the kitchen of someone's house or something. It doesn't seem like it's human error in that sense. But I suppose, I don't know why I'm going on a big COVID tangent here. I just get your thoughts on this. It seems to be a lot of anti-China thought on this now. People are talking about reparations, damages, punishment, sanctions, thing like that. Do you think there is a culpability to China? I realise this has got absolutely nothing to do with your book.
Well, it actually does. There is a parallel there because China is a horrific country, and it has been for a very long time.
Yeah.
But we haven't really been paying attention to it because it hasn't come onto our soil. So it's the same sort of thing with the Islamic issue. Like Islam has been terrorizing people, for generations, but nobody over here was paying attention to it until it came onto our soil. And then the same parallels are happening again, where as soon as you start to criticize the Chinese government, people say you're being gross and racist, in the same way that as soon as you criticize Islam, people say you're being gross and racist, right? So you're seeing that same parallel with the PC police coming in. And the truth is still that China, people talk about, but look how they were treating the Muslims there in the concentration camps. And all of that is true. They have been horrific to the Muslim population, but they've been horrific to their own population as well. This is a country that was executing over 1,000 people per year for all sorts of ridiculous offenses. They just kill people willy-nilly. And now we're starting to see it when people who speak out against the government all of a sudden disappear, like that doctor who, like his WhatsApp messages between him and other doctors were infiltrated, and they found all of the doctors that were talking about this outbreak, and they clamped down on all of them, and people's being, their doors being welded shut so that they can't leave their apartment buildings. And now we're starting to see how vicious that country is in a way that we hadn't seen before. And I think it's very important to criticize it. And I think it's very important to criticize, just like I think it's important to criticize Saudi Arabia or Iran or any of these other dictatorships that treat their people like garbage, worse than garbage. And when we criticize these governments, we do that because we're saying there are people under there that are being victimized, people that cannot speak up because they will be shot in the head for it. And so we need to speak up against this government and what they are doing, not only hurting their own people now, but now they're hurting us globally across the planet because of their perpetuation of their lies. And so we do, of course, I think that China is definitely to blame. The Chinese government knew what was going on and they wanted to keep it quiet. They allowed people from Wuhan to go across the entire planet when they were leaving for the Chinese New Year. And they knew that this was going on. They kept it from the rest of they protected the rest of their country, but, so they knew something was going on when they clamped down on Wuhan eventually. But, it's just absolutely heartbreaking. I watched a couple documentaries on this, and it just makes you so sick and it makes you so angry that, when you want to speak out against this government and then people come along and they say, oh, you're being racist. Oh, we should go to Chinatown or whatever it was that people are saying. Like, why does it always have to be one extreme or the other? Like, why does it have to be that when I am, yes, China did a horrible thing, but that has nothing to do with Chinatown in San Francisco, for example. You know what I mean?
It really
there's
is.
Nothing to do. Yeah, there's nothing to do with Chinese Americans. Like, it's people just assume the worst, and they're like, "Oh, you're racist and you hate all Chinese people." No, I'm saying the Chinese government is a vicious, lying, horrible dictatorship, and it's totalitarian, and I can't see how anybody could possibly defend it.
Yeah.
And I haven't said a word about Chinese individuals.
Well, your thoughts are very clear on that one for sure. I've got a number of Twitter questions for you as well, if you're happy to go through those with me.
Let's do it.
Okay, so our very own Iram Ramzan, co-host of the Taking the Myth podcast with me, has asked a very good question, actually. She asks, have your views on Islamic reform changed over the years?
Yes, they have. In the beginning, I used to think that it was not possible. And I still think that it's not possible to reform Islam, but I do believe that Muslims are capable, not just capable, they want to have as tenuous a relationship with their religion as your average Christian or your average Jewish person. I think that if they were living in countries that allowed them the freedom to do that, which, isn't true for most Muslim majority countries, then most Muslim people would not want to live, under Sharia, because it is, it's a horrible existence. It's a really difficult way to live. And having met more and more Muslims over the years that are, they're hanging on to their identity just because it's their identity, but they don't really want anything to do with any of the violence or the sexism or the racism or, all of the isms that are in Islam. They don't want anything to do with all of the homophobia or any of the political aspirations of the religion. And so I have changed my opinion from saying, that's pie in the sky, that's never going to happen, to, well, yeah, I can see this happening slowly but surely. And you can definitely see it happening in countries where they have the freedom to choose. And even in countries where they don't have the freedom to choose, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, which are fully Sharia countries, the internet is allowing them to see other ways of living. There's a counter narrative that's being allowed into the country that had never existed before. I mean, these are countries that are overwhelmingly, like over 90% Muslim. The government is Islamic. The schools are Islamic. The media is Islamic. Everything you're getting is just this one tone of Islam all the time. And now that they have the internet and they can, watch a Richard Dawkins video or, listen to a lecture from Christopher Hitchens, and they are opening their minds in a way that, it is allowing them to push back against their own totalitarian states. And it's incredibly heartwarming. And I honestly didn't think I'd live to see the day. I never thought I would live to see the day Saudi Arabian women were burning their niqabs and posting videos of it online. Like, holy cow, that is so incredibly motivating. It just makes you feel like anything is possible.
Nothing makes me smile more than seeing clips of defiance like that. Some Iranian girl dancing in the street, or something similar. I mean, it's something that's so small in our world, but
and knowing that they could be not just arrested for that, but they could be killed for that, and they're still willing to do it. Really makes you, puts everything into perspective and makes you really value, like, look how the tenacity of the human spirit.
Perfectly put. Okay, Jay Shapiro, filmmaker, you know him as well.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
He's asked about the role of emotion in your work and a right to be angry as a response to people who would dismiss your criticism of Islam and Diane's as, well, she's just angry because she has had a bad experience.
Yeah. This is a conversation Jay and I have had a few times. And because I am Arab, we're like hot-blooded. And so even when, it's kind of weird because I'm a mix of Canadian, which is super, super, polite and quiet and gentle, and then Arab, which is like the opposite of that. And so, I feel like I have sort of found a balance in between the two worlds. But when it comes to the issue of Islam, and especially when it comes to the issue of women or LGBT in Islamic countries, I am emotional. I am angry because every sane person should be angry and should be emotional. Anybody who has empathy should be angry and should be emotional. And I especially am because not the LGBT part, but the woman part is my experience. And it brings up a lot of, just a lot of past experiences. And I empathize with these women a lot more than somebody who hasn't experienced it. But, yeah, so I think that turns people off sometimes where they're used to the very, the old school British, which is the way Canadians are now, which is, very buttoned up and, we're very polite about things and we don't use the F word and whatever. And so when I'm speaking, I might come off as a little bit too aggressive for those kinds of people. And I used to in the beginning try to tone it down because I'd feel like, well, I don't want to alienate anybody. But honestly, now I'm at the point where I'm like, no, I'm not the one who needs to tone it down. You're the one who needs to tone it up. This is not, I shouldn't be these are people that have been living in this for so long and have been forced to be silent for so long. And now they are finally able to break through and finally able to speak up. Like, we should all be as loud as possible in support of them. And so, yeah, I don't think that anger or emotion, I think passion is probably the better word, because I don't feel anger. I'm over it. Everything that I talk about is like 15 years old, like when it comes to my own personal experience. I don't feel any anger over it anymore. I certainly did for a very long time. But now I'm kind of like, when I tell my story, it's almost like I'm telling the story of, somebody else's life. It's a past life. It's not my current life. But I do feel very passionate about the people that I'm helping through my organization, Free Hearts, Free Minds, or any of the people that are contacting me all the time, or any of the campaigns, the Twitter campaigns that we do. Yes, I feel very passionate about supporting them. And I wish people would feel a bit more passion sometimes.
Yeah, I certainly think that anger has its place, or, fiery passion, shall we say. It's always good to have that gear change, especially on something so important. But I think, we touched on it briefly before, the idea that if you're conversing in this arena through a critical lens, someone will always find something to try and discredit you. So even if you spoke about your experiences and your critique of Islam dispassionately, people would still, people who are always going to be cynical will say, well, this is just a product of your own experience. So there'll always be ways to discredit you. So I suppose in the meantime, you've just got to say what you think and say it honestly. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. I suppose last question then, and somebody's asked you, a gentleman called Carius has asked you to speak about your conversation with Eric Weinstein. What did I miss?
Oh, so Eric had posted something about a hijabi woman that skateboards, and she's a neurosurgeon or something like that. And so he was saying be careful not to assume that all women who wear hijab are oppressed, because look, I found one here who rides a skateboard.
Yeah.
And so I responded to him by saying, you are being unfortunately sucked into a single story, and then you're making this grand assumption based on this one individual skateboarding hijabi, which is like fantastic, good for her, but also whoop-de-fucking-do. Millions of women are, forced into this garb all over the world. And so we got into, he invited me onto his podcast, and I tried to keep the conversation to a minimum on Twitter so that we could just have the conversation on his podcast. But of course, it kept on escalating. And so eventually he ended up phoning me, and we had a phone conversation. And through the conversation, I was able to clarify to him that I don't care if one individual woman is happy when she's wearing the hijab. That has nothing to do with the fact that the ideology, that the purpose for wearing hijab is oppressive. It is oppression. Hijab is oppression, regardless of whether individual women feel oppressed by it or not, is not the point. And so he was finally able to get to what I was saying, because before that he was really saying hijab cannot be oppressive as long as there is at least one woman who doesn't see it that way. And that's a very, that was a very odd way of looking at it from my experience, because I'm saying, like, would you say that, Marxism or that Nazi Germany was not an oppressive regime because there were some people under it that were happy? Like, it's not, it doesn't change the fact that it is a horrific ideology. And so I think that that's kind of where we got to. But he's another one of the people that I was going to meet when I went to LA for Bill Maher. And of course, that trip never happened because of coronavirus.
Fucking pandemic. Oh, it's ruining everything. Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that after that conversation on the phone, both you and Eric left feeling better about the whole situation?
I think so. I think we personally felt better about the situation. I kind of have a very short fuse when it comes to, like, because in one of his tweets to me, he said to me, and I shit you not, like, I wish I could quote this. He basically said to me, "You're not understanding the reality of the situation, Yasmin."
Oh, yeah. No.
So,
oh dear.
So that's when I lost my shit a little bit, because, here he is, somebody who has no experience with Islam, no experience being a woman, no experience wearing a hijab, no understanding of it, really, like just a very, just a basic, super shallow understanding of it. And then he's telling me, who has really devoted the past, 5 years of my life to this fight. And so, yeah, that I kind of was feeling like I didn't even want to engage at that point, because I was just like, oh, that's so condescending.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that I did, and we were able to work through it. So I think we're okay now.
That's good. I suppose it's also a demonstration of the folly of Twitter conversations and disagreements. They never tend to end in a positive resolution, but a phone call tends to mop up a lot of the mess that can be caused by conversations in 240 characters or less. Okay, Yasmin, well, I've really enjoyed catching up with you. I absolutely love the book. It's out now. It's the audiobook version's available as well, which you read. So I'd highly recommend people to pick that up and just read about your experience, because we've spoke before and you've told me a lot, but there's a lot more in that book that I wasn't aware of as well. And there's a lot, my jaw was dropping on occasion with some of the revelations, but I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing, as passionate as you are and as knowledgeable as you are on it. I really do think it makes a difference.
Thank you so much. I really, really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Is there anything you want to point people towards before I let you get back to your afternoon?
Well, if they have an opportunity, then they can look up my organization, Free Hearts, Free Minds, that would be great. And then if you click on testimonials, you can read some testimonials from people that we have supported. And if you are so inclined, you can also click on the donate button and help us to help more people.
Perfect. I'll make sure I put a link to that in the show notes. But Yasmin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation, produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?